Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Nadim Chaudhry, and I'm recording this presentation following the presentation I did last night to the UWC Adriatic College here in Trieste or Duino near Trieste, giving them an overview of the energy transition and how I think the energy transition will evolve and how they can get involved, or indeed should get involved, in the energy transition and what potential skills they would need. So, in terms of helping them inform them on the decisions they're going to make as they start thinking about going into tertiary education, choosing universities, and indeed onward education. So, um, if we go forward. Why am I here? Why am I here? Not really a question about existential origins of the universe, but why am I here giving this presentation? Who am I? So I guess I'm here because I sat next to a man on an aeroplane who was reading a yachting magazine 21 years ago at the back of the plane. So I asked him, have you got a yacht? He said, well, no, I haven't got a yacht. And but I do have a habit of picking up literature, which I know nothing about when I'm at airports to learn something new. So I thought, interesting habit, and I started doing it myself. So I read a very boring magazine about golf, and then I picked up a book one day called The Carbon War with a picture of a fire on it, and it was talking about the background to the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol, which was one of the first UN-driven bits of legislation looking to reduce the impact of carbon emissions. Picked it up, and it's actually a surprisingly good read, and it details the negotiations for this piece of legislation, which end up not having a huge impact. But nonetheless, the American negotiation team comes out of the negotiations, and this is written by the author who's viewing the situation, and they're surrounded by lobbyists, and there's a lobbyist in particular whose name I recall was Brian Flannery, who was the external relations director for ExxonMobil, one of the American leading oil and gas companies. And Brian Flannery was wagging his finger at the American negotiation team, and the author was saying, look, you can see where the levers of power were. And it made me a little bit angry around the role that the oil and gas companies were playing then to suppress science and suppress technology change and act like 17th or 18th century Luddites in trying to destroy technology and not allow advancements of our technology. So at the end of the book, the author, Jeremy Leggett, says, right, I'm off to start a solar company. So when I finished the book, I said, right, I'm off to start a renewable energy events company, because I'd been doing for 8 years conferences on mobile telecoms technologies. And so in 2003, I decided to set up my own business looking at renewable energy technologies and creating events to try and accelerate the market and other wider aspects to climate change, such as carbon markets, which were indeed an offshoot of that Kyoto Protocol. So since that time, I've created over 500 events over the last 21 years in 40 different countries, and events ranging from training courses for 10 people up to big congresses for 2,500 people, and events that are focused on accelerating the commercial deployment of clean solutions to alleviate climate change, predominantly around renewable electricity for many years, but other solutions around the energy system. I've met, I think, 4 or 5 prime ministers, obviously thousands and thousands of senior executives, directors, CEOs. I've listened to over 10,000 presentations. I've met some incredibly inspiring people, listened to lots of inspiring talks, and equally some less inspiring. I've read a lot of biographies. I understand a lot about what it takes to become a senior leader in the energy industry. So I thought it would be useful to share that with you today. What am I going to talk about? Hopefully in sort of 25 to 30 minutes. Going to cover very quickly the Anthropocene, what that means, clean energy transition, fossil fuels, energy markets, some of the good news, some of the bad news, a bit of detail around the value chain so you can begin to understand the jigsaw puzzle of different interests, commercial interests, some of the geopolitics, the value chains, talk a little bit about what I see personally as the jobs and skill sets, and then we can take some questions. Obviously, there were a lot of questions last night, so I'll try and recall some of those questions in this recorded version. This is our blue planet. It's blue because it's 71% sea and 29% Earth. There was always an argument about how the Earth can absorb lots of CO2, predominantly obviously from the fossil fuel lobbyists, and that mankind doesn't have a huge impact on the planet. The planet can naturally correct itself. We look at the blue planet, and yeah, the humanity lives on just 29%. And in that, within a majority of mankind lives in a narrow range of about 1,000 meters. The topsoil, which provides all of our food and agriculture, is about 30 centimeters. So there's not a huge amount of A, atmosphere, B, topsoil where we live. So it's a very thin, livable crust around the blue planet, I think is really the first point what I'd like to make. The problem that we see is very much climate change and the dramatic increases of CO2 and the resulting impact that's having on our temperature. So I think that is clearly the greatest impact. And the phrase, I guess, around mankind's impact is the Anthropocene. So we are having an impact upon the planet. Climate change is the outstanding and clear danger. Beyond that, there are obviously huge amounts of impacts around biodiversity loss, the plastification of our environment, and many other challenges. But for me, climate change is the most pressing. And where are all of these emissions coming from? When you look at the graph, it's pretty obvious that energy is the predominant problem. So our energy system has to be decarbonized. Most of the nations of the world are on board, or I think 60% of our global GDP is agreed to become net zero by 2050. So we're in a race to try and get to net zero by 2050 in order to maintain that climate change within 2 degrees bounds of a temperature rise, which is still risky. It's still a massively untried science experiment that we're conducting with the planet. But energy is clearly the problem. So that was clearly where I've spent the last 20 years trying to accelerate solutions. What is energy? There's three main markets. Up until now, have been quite distinct markets. So you have electricity, electrons that come out of the plug that power our appliances at home and massively around the industrial businesses and economies around the world. Transport, movement of people and goods around the planet, and heat in the northerly climes to keep us warm, but all equally for industrial heat, for industrial processes, and in the southern climes, obviously keeping us cool. As you'll see by these graphs, they're predominantly dominated by fossil fuels. So it's worthwhile having a little understanding about the power of fossil fuels and what they have done for us, because obviously they get quite a bad rap these days, but it's important to try and understand the dramatic impact that they have had upon human society. So before the Industrial Revolution, life was pretty short and a lot of hard work. Yeah, we successfully domesticated animals, I think about 10,000 years ago, and we were using them for pulling plows and doing some of our agriculture. mobility, obviously, and pulling wagons and horse riding. And we had harnessed wind and hydro for some of that repetitive hard work around maybe crushing some of our staple crops, our grains, into flour. And we used biomass wood for heating and keeping warm. But since we started unlocking the power of fossil fuels, initially obviously with coal, and now latterly then with oil, and now latterly with natural gas, we have had this whole explosion of energy. A human today uses 700 times more energy than a human just in the 19th century. And the per capita use of oil is around about 800 kilograms per person. And what all of that energy translates to is about, in a developed economy, is approximately having 200 slaves working for you day and night, providing their energy per person. So it's that huge toil, that labor that is done, is carried by the power of fossil fuels. So it's important not to underestimate the challenge we have when we are looking to take fossil fuels out of our energy system. The Industrial Revolution has also led to what I call the four pillars, not what I, but various authors call the four pillars of modern society: steel, cement, ammonia, and plastics. All have had dramatic impacts upon our economies and our ability to produce a modern society with all of its technology and wonders. Steel is obviously, the major component of all of our metals. Obviously reinforces concrete, enables us to create all of the machines, the cars, etc. Cement has enabled us to build big buildings, huge infrastructure, bridges and ports. Ammonia has had a dramatic impact upon our ability to feed ourselves. I think in 1950 there were 2.5 billion people on the planet. Yet we were only able to adequately feed about 800 to 900 million. So 65% of the people were undernourished in 1950 of that 2.5 billion population. Now we are able to adequately feed 7.2 to 3 billion people. And we still have obviously a problem with 800 odd million people that are undernourished. But the power of ammonia, the power of its ability as a fertilizer to give nitrogen into our agricultural systems, into our plants, has enabled us to feed a population of over 7.3 billion. If we didn't have ammonia, then we would probably be able to only feed about 1 billion people. And finally, plastics again gets a bad rap for the law of unintended consequences, and primarily using plastics for plastic bottles, but obviously plastic waste, it does not biodegrade. But if we think about the positive benefits of plastic as the miracle material of the 1950s, and if we think about healthcare and trying to operate healthcare efficiently without plastic, so obviously involving syringes and catheters and sheeting and all of the incredible benefits of that amazing material. But as I said, they will have unintended consequences, none more so than obviously the use of burning fossil fuels. So where are we in this energy transition to decarbonize our energy system? As I mentioned, we've got electrons and we've got molecules, which are predominantly, obviously, heat, and which is methane, natural gas, as the fossil fuel companies like to call it. It was a good bit of branding, and oil for transport, because for transport applications, power to weight ratio is important because you have to carry your fuel with you. So oil is an amazing molecule, an amazing energy-rich substance which can power obviously cars and trucks and ships and planes. We have been successful in decarbonizing and having a huge rise of renewable energy over the past specifically 10 years, but took a good decade before that in terms of developing technologies and pushing technologies up the TRLs, the technology readiness levels. So we are approximately a 30% renewable electricity in the global electricity grid. Over the next decade, going from the 2020s to the 2030s, we should be able to push into the 60s towards 70%. The decade after, the 2030s to 40s, I would expect us to be getting to 80% to 90% renewable electricity in the grid, depending upon how big that grid grows. So I guess the next point around that electricity mix is that it is, as I said, evolving mix. So this is the generation mix, the electricity mix by fuel source for Italy in 2020. And it's 48% natural gas, it's 40% hydro and renewables, and just 6% coal. So 20, 30 years ago, it was dominantly coal with little gas and no renewables and a little bit of hydro. But as different technologies evolve and transition, the mix changes. So why have we been successful in getting 24% of renewables into the grid and predominantly taking coal out of the mix? It's because of this. It's because of the cost. The cost of renewables has plummeted, specifically PV, photovoltaic, solar, and equally pretty well on onshore wind. So why is that, and what is happening here? I think it's important to sort of unpick this slide a little bit. So there's something called learning rates. Learning rates apply to typically when you double the global installed base of the technology, the costs come down by a percentage. So that's called the learning rate. The learning rate of solar PV for the last 10 years has been minus 85%. So its learning rate has been about 36% for every global doubling. With onshore wind on land, the learning rate has been 23%. So far with offshore wind, which is still early on its rollout, the learning rate has been 10%. So what is happening there, and why are we able to learn so much? So with solar, there has been dramatic improvements in the efficiency. So in the actual technology, the ability to absorb light photons and convert those into electrons. So we had Berg cells and went to Perk cells, or vice versa. I can't quite remember, but different, more efficient ways that the silicon can absorb those photons. We went to bigger modules that are more efficient. We went to went from polysilicon to monosilicon because we went from monosilicon first to polysilicon because it was cheaper to produce polysilicon, but then we found a cheap way to make monosilicon. Then we went back to monosilicon because they're better absorbing light efficiencies. So there was trades-off between costs and efficiencies. We had various different platforms for trackers, so that tilted the panels to track the sun. We had different angles, and eventually the industry settled around a single axis because it consumes less electricity and is more efficient and has less operational costs over the life cycle of a plant. And then we introduced bifacial, so that the solar panels can absorb some of the albedo effect of light photons bouncing off the ground and being absorbed on the underside of the panel. So there were all of these marginal gains, these incremental gains that began to push solar down the cost curve. And it's important to understand that solar is very modular. It's produced, it's a manufacturing product. So it gains from the economies of scale, from the learning of machines and robots and the actual manufacturing process. In order to effectively measure the cost of energy, you need a number called the LCOE, which basically stands for the levelized cost of electricity. And you're levelizing the CapEx, the initial capital expenditure, and the OpEx, the operational expenditure for the life cycle of a power plant, so over 20 years, and you were dividing that by the amount of electricity. So you're able to compare renewable sources of power with fossil fuel sources of power, where they have greater OPEX and sometimes lower CAPEX, because they obviously cost to dig coal out of the ground and put it into a coal-fired power station, whereas obviously wind and solar are free, so there are no fuel costs with renewables. So this LCOE number allows us to compare different technologies. And if you have a look at coal here in the graph, you'll see there's been no learning rate, and coal has not become cheaper over the last 10 years. Why is that? Just, no innovation, and there is just some sheer costs to going underground, digging out a very heavy material, bringing it up to the surface, putting it on a huge train, taking that train to a big coal-fired power station, which is essentially the same burner technology, burning it, and then shipping all of that electricity across to the population centers, because obviously a coal-fired power plant has to be away from them, because it also emits loads of particulate matter and stuff, which is very bad for our lungs. So coal has not gone anywhere, and solar has smashed through its learning curve, as has wind, to become the cheapest sources of electrons. Interesting to look at nuclear, where there's been no learning rate, and indeed it's become more expensive because the industry is not focusing on one design. Every nuclear power plant is a bespoke suit. It's made to measure, as it were. There are multiple different platforms out there, and indeed safety aspects and reactions to the Fujiwara accident after the 2016 tsunami. I can't remember when the tsunami was, so it was before then, 2006 maybe. Have led to increased concerns around safety. So nuclear is not learning. So what do I think is going to happen now, and what are we doing in terms of trying to decarbonize the molecule market? The first thing is to use electricity, to use clean electricity to decarbonize the molecule market. So clearly we're seeing a huge rise in electric vehicles, and oil consumption for passenger vehicles going down. Likewise, in the heat market, there's a huge efficiencies around using a heat pump compared to using gas to heat your homes, and cost is essentially driving those. So we expect there to be a massive use of electricity for markets and applications that were previously used in the molecule market. How much will happen? This is where there's a huge debate, and no one really knows, because it will depend on the technology race between different electrical solutions and different clean molecular solutions or molecule solutions over the next 20 years or 30 years. Potentially 50-50 in terms of electrons, potentially even 80-20, with there being a flip from a 20% electron market and an 80% molecule market to there being a 80% electron market and a 20% molecule market. But most people think somewhere between the 50-50 and the 80-20, with molecules playing a role to help balance the system, the electricity system, and also enable us to do certain applications that can only be done with clean molecules. And when we talk about clean molecules, we're typically referring to now green hydrogen, which is, so we need use by using renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then you use that hydrogen, either you compress it and ship it, or you convert it into ammonia or methanol, or other clean molecules or derivatives of hydrogen. So good news is that it's happening in terms of gathering pace. So global investment in the energy transition technologies is growing considerably. This has actually been updated since this slide was produced. I think 2022 we actually achieved $1.3 trillion of investment, and in 2027 sorry, in 2022, we achieved $1.3 trillion investment. In 2023, we actually achieved $1.8 trillion of investment. But it's not enough. In order to achieve net zero, we need to grow our investment in energy transition to about $4.3 trillion by 2030. So we need to more than double this market in the next 6 years. But change is non-linear, and we're beginning to enter the steep part of the S curve, and we could be on track. It's still going to involve a lot of hard work and commitment to get to a $4.3 trillion market by 2030, which is obviously only 6 years away, but it is still possible. We live in a global economy, which is roughly $100 trillion. I think energy is around about $3 trillion. So yeah, $1.8 trillion spent last year on renewables. But sadly, obviously, that also means over $1 trillion spent on the existing fossil fuel system. So yeah, a huge need to spend new capex on renewables, on electrified heat, electrified vehicles, on hydrogen, and the other sort of cleaner sources of energy generation. And this is the $13 billion, 5 gigawatt Al Maktoum, Dubai solar field when it's finished. This isn't finished yet. I think they're only a quarter of the way through. But this is the image of it in its final state. So just carpeting the desert with these single axis solar and powering the city that you see up there on the horizon, which is obviously Dubai. And if you remember when I started working, the clean energy market was only 32 billion. So this is 13 billion in just one project. So it just shows that the scale of what's happening. And this solar field is going to be replicated and is being replicated in a lot of countries in the Middle East and indeed North Africa as well, where there's lots of space, and then we can connect these solar fields up into a connected grid that will hopefully connect into Europe and some of the other population densities, and indeed be able to power Africa as well using this technology. Dogger Bank, another $14 billion project. So just two projects, and we're at 27 billion, which is almost all that was spent in renewable energy in 2004. It's worth talking a little bit about the scale of wind here. I mean, these turbines are now, the offshore ones are now coming up to, I think they're going from 16 megawatts to 18 megawatts in size. And basically that means that the blades are around about 100 meters, so sort of 200 meters diameter. So they're reaching now heights, if you include obviously the tower and the hub height of 300 meters, which for comparison, for those of you who've been to London and have seen the Shard, that building is 310 meters high. So just one turbine is 300 meters high or 310 meters high, I think some of them. And this Dogger Bank will have about 270 of these huge towers. So imagine 270 London Shards spreading across the sea is the scale of modern renewables is staggering. And onshore, some of the new range turbines, they've grown up from, originally they were 1 megawatts and they went to 2, and then they went to 5, and then there were huge giants that were 7 megawatts on land. There are indeed some now, I think in the Mongolian desert, which are now 10 megawatts. And again, they are coming up to the 250 meters in height. So a staggering amount of material, and staggering to see wind being able to move these huge wind turbines. In terms of the future of wind, obviously there are restricted places where people want to have big, huge turbines disrupting your landscape that are 250 meters tall. But wind is thankfully going offshore. So these huge turbines here, and wind is also going floating. So it's not floating independently, but they are anchored to the ground. So it enables wind to go out to deeper water. So not where you have to have fixed foundations on the surface. So you can expand and capture more wind resources with floating wind, and it's likely that floating wind will also follow the cost curves down. But clearly, something that's moving in the sea is always going to have some tough operational expenditures. Salt water is corrosive. Movement is what wears material down quite hard. The interesting thing around green hydrogen is that it can allow us to use renewable resources that we previously wouldn't have thought of because they're too far away from population densities. They're not worth the cost of connecting a huge cable. Some of these cables, I think, weigh upwards of 60 tons a meter for a massive thick HVDC cable. So they're incredibly expensive cables. But if you think about Greenland, or if you think about Punta del Este in southern Chile, I think, which is one of the windiest spots in the world. Indeed, if you were really serious about capturing the best wind in the world, you would put wind turbines on Antarctica. But don't worry, I'm not suggesting that. Just trying to draw the example that we can use and build wind now, where we don't need to connect into the electricity grid, and we can really harness the best winds in the world if we want to produce the cheapest, green hydrogen in the world, and then ship that and use that as an input into our clean energy system. So it's just an example. The $8.3 billion project NEOM is the first gigawatt scale hydrogen project, clean hydrogen project, with a 4 gigawatt solar and wind park. I think about 2 gigawatts of electrolyzers that will then convert and create through the Haldo-Topsoe process, or the Topsoe-Haber-Bosch process, sorry, to create ammonia, which is more easily shippable as a derivative of clean hydrogen. So around 240,000 tons of clean hydrogen coming out of this single project in northwest Saudi Arabia, and being shipped to clients in Europe and Asia. At another scale, we have another client of mine, Smart Energy, very smart project development group, who are looking to decarbonize the ceramic industry in southern Spain. So a smaller project, but nonetheless shows the variety of what's happening in the energy transition, and this is happening near Valencia. Very close to here, just 2 hours away from here, located up the coast from here. We're in Trieste, but on the Croatian island of Krk, KRK. A client is building the green energy park, so it's going to be a green molecule port to bring in clean ammonia from the MENA region. So ammonia is an energy dense liquid, so it enables ships are quite low in the water, so you need to have a deep water port to accept these ships in. And Krk is well situated strategically, with good connections into the heartland of Europe, of I guess Central Europe, and around the Ruhr Valley, where there are lots of chemical plants, and demand for clean molecules is going to be a lot. So that's happening just up the coast, and they're building a lot of infrastructure to handle the import of, as I said, green ammonia. Moving on to some of the practical thoughts around specifically what you can do and what you should be doing as a 17-year-old or 18-year-old thinking about your pathway into the world of work and getting involved in the energy transition after you've done maybe your tertiary education at university. So this is from a client, Worldwide Recruitment Energy, of the skills deficit in specifically the hydrogen industry. So I think the main point I am including here is just the sheer variety of skills that are needed, from trading, from communications, from general management, from project managers, from commercial and business developers, and of course, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, process engineers, industrial engineers, and design engineers. But there's a whole variety, including even physicists and people working on new technology, experts on electrolyzers and fuel cells, chemical engineers. There's a whole variety of different skill sets that are needed. And yes, we need more lawyers. The jobs as we embark, I guess, in the second decade of the energy transition, and the landscape for employment is posed for growth. As I mentioned, we're entering the steeper part of the S curve. Experts in renewables, batteries, green hydrogen technologies. The global energy sector employs nearly 60 million people, but only about 12.7 million of them are working in renewables as of 2021. I think that number would have increased substantially, and clearly by in the next 3 or 4 years, it will grow hugely in terms of that sort of 60 million people will begin to convert increasingly into working in the renewable clean energy sector as opposed to the fossil fuel sector. A notable trend to pull out is the rising significance of hybrid profiles. What does that mean? It means people that are both technical and business. And so you have, engineers who can talk to customers is the holy grail, and people that can couple an understanding are often the most valuable people. You often see, from my experience, there are a lot of people that have their first degrees and their first specialism is in some of the harder sciences, so in the engineering sector, in the technology sectors, and then they layer on top, often after a few years in the field, an MBA. The business degrees come in later, as also people develop their careers and look at maybe going into the management and development of their businesses. There is obviously also always a route which is purely technical into sort of R&D and other areas. But I think it's important for you at this stage to understand that there is this need for hybrid profiles. We at World Hydrogen Leaders have trained, I think, 5,000 people on a lot around technology, and a lot of those people aren't necessarily people with STEM backgrounds or engineers. So a lot of people have come into the industry from other industries, from fast-moving consumer goods, etc. So we are now training them on technology. So they have had maybe commercial skills first and hard science skills or more technology skills second. But I think you should be aware you need to develop both of those sort of skill sets. And indeed, the full sort of skill set is obviously the polymaths. History is littered with the impact of polymaths. I think it's an incredible source of innovation, from Aristotle through obviously to people like Ada Lovelace and not to mention him, Elon Musk as well. And I guess the point around cross-disciplinary innovation. So the Harvard Business School has seen that innovators are 3 times more likely to connect ideas if they can work across disciplines and create breakthrough solutions. So that is the source of innovation is often that polymer, that cross-polymerization, cross-fertilization of ideas from different fields and bringing those together, rather than necessarily just that deep, narrow expertise. Finally, a point about EQ, and obviously you're a very, very bright cadre of people, but think about your EQ. And what is EQ? It's your empathy, it's your ability to work with other humans. And I've met a lot of top CEOs and top leaders, and they are all got amazing people skills. They all possess high EQs. They are there to lead people, and it's people that drive the energy transition. So you need to think about how you develop those skills to lead people and lead those cross-disciplinary teams if you want to be a leader. But I think people often focus around technology in the energy transition. But for me, obviously coming from a people business and bringing people together, it's people that ultimately make the change. So think about your people skills and your EQ as well. That is it. Thanks for listening. My final slide is, they have discovered water on the moon, and water obviously can be used and created with solar energy, which there is a fair amount on the moon, into hydrogen, and we could be, I think, having our moon base on the moon powered by hydrogen in your generation. So many thanks. Thanks for listening.